everyone. Welcome back to the special federal election series on the Northern Sentinels podcast. This is where I'm speaking to a variety of experts on national defense. And today I'm fortunate to have Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer with us. Whitney, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be on.
Why don't you give the listeners a bit of an idea of who you are and why you have a background in the North and sovereignty that allows you to speak to this issue?
Sounds great. So I'm a professor at Trent University in the School for the Study of Canada there, and also privileged to hold the Canada Research Chair in the study of the Canadian North at that institution. Also lead and serve a North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network, NADSEN, which is funded through the Department of National Defense's MINES program. So funding that allows us as an independent group of experts to really dig deep into issues regarding continental defense and Arctic security. So this is a subject, Arctic security, that I've been working on for about 25 years at this point in time. Really interested in understanding sovereignty security, both from a Canadian national lens, from the standpoint of the state, but also been really blessed to be able to get a real intimate understanding of it from the perspective of communities, largely through my work with the Canadian Rangers. I'm privileged to serve as their honorary lieutenant colonel in 1st Canadian Ranger Patrol Group, but also say that first and foremost, I'm their biggest fan for what they contribute to Canada.
So what is the historic view of the Arctic reference sovereignty, defense, security by Canadians?
So I think first and foremost, we have this real deep-seated sense of anxiety around sovereignty. I'd say point of origin probably is the Alaska boundary dispute back at the turn of the 1900s, when we're in a discussion over where the line was drawn between the Yukon and Alaska, which the U.S. had gone and acquired in 1867, the same year we became a country. And in essence, the British, during the discussions, the arbitration tribunal, seemed to side with the Americans over things that had nothing to do with Canada, because they wanted some favorable conditions for a Venezuelan dispute that they had with the Americans back in the day. So Canada came out of this feeling like, wow, nobody's looking out for us. Uncle Sam wants to go and gobble up our territory. Even Mother England, won't protect us. We gotta pull up our bootstraps and stand up for ourselves when it comes to the Arctic. And again, having a very minimal, modest size population, not commenting on the quality of the population, fantastic people who live in the Arctic, but a small population in a vast territory, has been this constant question of how much is enough for us to have sovereignty, which is one of these amorphous terms. What does sovereignty mean? The lawyers would say it's the internationally recognized right to control activities in a given space. Others would suggest it's actually all of the activities that go on within the space. So from that standpoint, what is the nature of the threat to our Arctic? Second World War, during the Cold War, concerns about threats to Canada that perhaps previously had not existed. Understandings that perhaps the threat is not to the Arctic. It's not that our Arctic is going to be conquered by a rival country. Concerns that maybe the United States and others won't respect our sovereignty. Most of those were sort of solved by the 1950s when it came to the land territory. Still lingering questions around maritime spaces. But for the most part, Canadians saying it's not that the Arctic is militarily threatened. It's more that the Arctic is important to overall defense of North America, because bombers or eventually missiles with ballistic trajectories are going to pass over the Arctic or through the Arctic to strike at targets like Ottawa or Toronto or Chicago. So from that standpoint, how do you use the Arctic as part of strategic defense in depth? How do you build radar systems or defensive systems that give us a maximum amount of time to detect things that are threatening North America and then get up the ability to defeat them, or at the very least, some kind of second strike capability, which means in deterrence, no one would want to come and mess with us. Where this has shifted in recent years is, I think, a lot more, again, rejuvenated concern, or revitalized concern about security of North America. A lot of this wrapped up in the notion that the Arctic is now threatened because of climate change, because of advanced technologies, delivery systems that we have no ability to detect, never mind defeat at present, and then also broader geopolitical competition. I see these issues actually as getting mixed up often and confused with one another, but that Arctic security is now something that is very much on Canadians' minds. We often package it under the language of sovereignty. I think that's often a bit of a distraction to us. But if we're looking at questions of security, this is something that's factoring into all of the major federal parties' election platforms right now. And while they're going to disagree on some details or specific proposals, what I think is striking is just how much there is a consensus that this is a major election issue, not something that it's traditionally been in Canadian history, to answer your question. Stephen Harper made it one in 2005. We could go back to John Diefenbaker in 1958 with his Northern Vision, which was around building up a northern economy more than anything else. But now here we find ourselves in 2025, where many people are making Arctic security one of the core pillars, at least when we're talking about defense.
What do you see as the actual threats?
So I love to break it down, Chris, into threats through the Arctic, to the Arctic, and in the Arctic. So when I think about threats through the Arctic, we are facing a more precarious geopolitical environment globally. Competition between China, Russia, and the United States factoring in. So the reality remains that the Arctic is a venue or a thoroughfare for certain delivery systems that threaten North America, so threaten Canada as a whole. So when we have Prime Minister Carney a couple of weeks ago announcing a $6 billion investment in Arctic over-the-horizon radar, so buying an off-the-shelf Australian system, we talk about that as being Arctic security, an Arctic system. And I'd say to readers, yeah, it's going to give us domain awareness, so coverage, situational awareness throughout our Arctic and out beyond our Arctic islands for the first time. Where are those arrays going to be based? Southwestern Ontario, right? Probably somewhere in cottage country for those of us who are from, Toronto or points south of it. Just because you want to have the maximum arcs and a maximum coverage. And if we look at the way the Australians deploy their system, covering their northern territory, it makes sense for it to be based south. So it gives us coverage over the Arctic, and it's part of defending Canada because we need to know what's going on in our Arctic to know what kind of threats are coming towards us. But for the most part, it's not because we have more acute threats to the Arctic, where we have adversaries who are wanting to conquer our Arctic and take it from us. Right? The Arctic is part of this overall dynamic of Canadian and North American defense. So then what are the threats to the Arctic? Are they military kinetic threats, so things that go boom? There are some we have to be mindful of, but I don't think that's the primary threat. Certainly, I think it's irresponsible when commentators talk about analogies to Ukraine and suggesting that we could face an invasion equivalent to Ukraine because we share a maritime boundary with the Russians across the North Pole. Not going to happen, right? We did those exercises back in 1946 and realized just how hard it is to sustain our own force domestically in a peacetime environment. That's not what we're looking at. What is the nature of these threats? Maybe it would be some kind of small diversionary attack. Is that going to primarily take the form of little green men coming and attacking us? Or is it in the form of disruption activities, right? In an Internet of Things where our world is connected? Is it cyber attacks? We are facing a world of narrative competition, information warfare. We would be naive to think that the Arctic doesn't factor into that. Worried about foreign investment. A lot of the focus is on China gaining footholds right in strategic locations or strategic industries. We can watch what's going on in the European high north in terms of disruption of GPS, other what are called below the threshold of armed conflict or hybrid or gray zone threats. But then the challenge there, Chris, becomes which of those are primarily military problem sets versus ones that require whole of government or whole of society solutions across the different security agencies and actors. Then we talk about threats within the Arctic itself. And here's where I suggest many of these are related to climate and environmental change. What's pressing for a lot of Northerners is increasing probability of things like wildland fires or flooding or severe storms disrupting security at a community level. It's disruption to food security because now patterns of accessing different locations over the ice have become more unpredictable. So I think sometimes we talk about the Arctic as if climate change is driving the probability of conflict because it makes the Arctic more accessible. And I always say that's in very specific domains. I mean, Chris, from your background within the Air Force, I'd say, does the melting of the Arctic sea ice make the Arctic more accessible to aircraft? No, I mean, more unpredictable weather pattern probably means the opposite. it may be less accessible. From a land domain standpoint, less accessible. From a cyber domain, we're generally climate change is not something that has a direct correlation with being able to access data using fiber or satellites. So trying to also be very precise of what domains are we talking about, what scenarios, and what sort of category of security are we trying to discern. So a lot of the focus is on national defense solutions, but I'd suggest these security threats are often broader than national defense. And while I very much wholeheartedly support smart military investments and bolstering our ability to respond to incidents in the Arctic, including by the military, I also don't want this to be thrust upon the military as something that sucks all of the oxygen out of the room and prevents us from doing things that we've often done very well in the past, which is how do we defeat conventional military threats? We generally like to defeat them as far away from Canada as possible. And it would be a shame if we saw ourselves draining resources from expeditionary capabilities, meaning outside of Canada, to deal with imagined Arctic military threats that we really need to stress test whether or not they actually exist.
Does this moment feel different to you? I mean, you mentioned that all the federal parties are talking about the North, and whether they're conflating sovereignty, security, defense. But does this moment in the nation's history feel different at all to you?
I think it does. I think we've got to a point where we hear all of the territorial premiers, for example, calling for investments, being very supportive of defense investments, also seeing this as linking to dual use capabilities or investments, meaning both military and civilian benefits. I think there's a lot of expectations there that all of the different federal leaders, I think, really need to be conscious about, to be thinking about, what can be dual use and what should not be dual use. But that might be a different discussion we have. I think just seeing all of the different leaders coming together and seeing that this is an important topic of consideration that is worth putting emphasis and platforms on answering is something that is quite different. I think the Arctic is not simply a niche issue or a boutique issue to drum up nationalist support, right? In essence, it's seen as something that is substantive, and we're talking about sizable amounts of money to do the kinds of investments that are being called upon. This includes those over-the-horizon radar, not only the Arctic one I just mentioned, but also the polar one, the next step, which is actually going to be based in the Arctic and is actually about extending right over the pole and theoretically being able to monitor not just what's going on within Canadian space, but right over into Russian, Chinese space. This is really fascinating. These are big moments that are going to open up questions about things like our stance on missile defense and so on, that are important discussions that Canadians need to have. It also invites us to think about striking that right balance between what are defense investments and what are investments in communities. And again, I don't bring this up in a partisan sense, but just Prime Minister Carney's announcement of the Arctic over-the-horizon radar, which again, as I mentioned, is sort of a Defense of Canada, Defense of North America project being wrapped as an Arctic one, also having at the same time relating to announcements about Arctic infrastructure and hundreds of millions of dollars going into things which are defending the Arctic. And then also having built into that promised investments in housing and energy security in the Arctic. So very much human security pieces, and thinking, gosh, we're seeing here sort of a way of understanding that Canadian politicians realize the country, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? We can talk about continental defense within a global deterrence concept, and we can talk about defending the Arctic, and we can talk about human security, and we can think about spending money in all of these things rather than setting up like a really dangerous either or scenario. Because I think we all lose in terms of security if we're seeing this as trade-offs where we're either doing human security and looking after Northerners, or we're investing in national defense. Hey, what makes us great is we're going to do both.
Yeah, let's close out the short by asking you if you had 5 minutes with whoever the next prime minister is. So PM gets elected, forms government. You got 5 minutes to provide some advice or to ask the prime minister, this is what your main action should be. What would that look like?
So it'd be threefold. First of all, it's domain awareness. And this is everything from seabed to outer space, investing in radar systems, subsurface, maritime systems, capabilities that allow us to get an understanding of what's going on in the region, and not to lose sight that one of those key sensor systems are people living in the region. Here's where the Canadian Rangers, Inuit Guardians, Coast Guard Auxiliary, a whole bunch of different actors are keen to contribute to understanding what's going on and detecting anomalies. So that's first and foremost, can't go wrong, increasing our awareness of what's going on in the region. Second piece, do not revisit the F-35 piece. I'm not paid by Lockheed Martin. It's just we went through a decision-making cycle to arrive at that. It's creating the enabling infrastructure to allow us to take resources that are going to be appropriately based in the South for the most part, but are going to allow us to have them deploy to the North and forward project from northern locations as needed. So to me, that is key, recognizing that some of this will also have civilian benefits, some of it will not. Building hangars for the F-35, I don't know what they cost, $400 million, $500 million a piece, right? With all the suites of sensors to allow us to have domain, dominance and information dominance and command and control in a battle space. These are not something that are going to have civilian access to. So let's be honest about those conversations. Let's lay it out, but also be creative about thinking about where we can be proceeding on some of the strategic infrastructure developments that Northerners have been crying out for a long time. Grays Bay Port and Road Project, completing the Mackenzie Valley Highway, for example, not thinking that these are going to be primarily funded out of defense budgets. That's irresponsible. That's not going to work us towards 2% or 5% of GDP as per J.D. Vance's calls yesterday for us to do as NATO members, but certain sections can be. Let's think creatively about things like creating sections of highways that are paved, are longer and wider, that they can serve as backup airfields. Chris, given your experience, you can speak to it, right? What's the first thing that would happen in a general conflict is an adversary would go and crater the known airfields that we have, right? You want to make sure you have backups. There are ways of thinking about how we can improve our resilience in the case of things that we hope will never happen in Canada, but will also represent ways of investing smartly, because yes, that will help us to advance some of these big projects. So again, thinking creatively, and most importantly, not to set up a false dichotomy. So basically a false situation where people are saying we're either investing in people, we're either investing in Northerners, or we're investing in national defense. The recipe has got to include both. And going forward, I think we do find ourselves at this really opportune time where the calls are there from Northern leadership, the spirit of nothing about us without us, the notion that Northerners are at the table or setting an agenda. We have that agenda set. We've spent decades of clarifying what the needs are in the North, both military and civilian. Now what we need is leadership and political will to actually realize some of these opportunities. And I find from that standpoint, it's actually an exciting time. A perilous time, precarious time in terms of global affairs, including our relationship with our premier partner, right, who have sent us some strange signals from the White House in the last few months, but going forward, realizing we actually do face a lot of opportunities. And I think the Arctic is one of those areas where investing in Canada, we're also investing in North American defense, and that long term is going to serve us well in terms of that important relationship with the U.S.
Whitney, thanks so much for lending your voice and your expertise to this special federal election series of the Northern Sentinels podcast.
Thanks, Chris.